No way. This can't be real. The boy's fingers trembled as he flipped open the leather wallet, his breath hitching when he saw the name on the ID inside. Jungkook. His wide, dirt-streaked eyes reflected the neon city lights, his heart hammering against his ribs like a wild animal trapped in a cage. Around him, Seoul was alive. Blaring car horns, chatter of pedestrians, the scent of rain lingering on the pavement. But for him, the world had narrowed down to the wallet in his hands. The boy, Seojun, was no stranger to hunger. At 15, he had mastered the art of survival, dodging security guards near convenience stores, finding the least moldy bread in trash bins, and avoiding the shadows where other desperate souls lurked. Yet now, fate had handed him something else entirely. Jungkook's wallet wasn't just any wallet. It was thick, expensive, and filled with more cash than Seojun had ever seen in his entire life. His stomach twisted. One night without hunger. One night without cold. One night where he didn't have to fight for scraps. And yet, his fingers hesitated. A loud thud yanked him from his thoughts. A man had collapsed a few meters away, drawing gasps from onlookers. Seojun's instincts screamed at him to move, get away before someone accused him of something. But then he saw it. The man was Jungkook. His breaths were ragged, his skin pale under the harsh streetlights. Seojun's pulse spiked. He glanced at the wallet, then at Jungkook, a battle waging inside him. Run. Leave. Take the money. But instead, he clenched his jaw and made his decision. Seojun sprinted forward, dropping to his knees beside Jungkook. His voice cracked as he shook the idol's shoulder. Hey! Wake up! Jungkook barely stirred. His body was burning up. The crowd hesitated, their phones raised, filming but not acting. Seojun growled under his breath. Cowards. He dug his fingers into Jungkook's wrist, searching for a pulse. Faint. Too faint. A taxi screeched to a stop. Seojun didn't think, he just moved. With strength he didn't know he had. He hooked Jungkook's arm over his shoulder and hauled him toward the cab. The driver balked, eyeing Seojun's tattered hoodie with suspicion. I need to take him to a hospital. Seojun's voice cracked. Please. A pause. Then the doors unlocked. As the taxi sped through the city, Seojun's grip tightened around Jungkook's wrist. He had saved a man tonight. But had he just thrown away his only chance to survive? The taxi's tires screeched to a halt in front of the emergency entrance. Seojun barely waited for the driver to speak before he shoved the door open, hauling Jungkook out with every ounce of strength he had left. Help! Someone help! His voice cracked, raw with desperation. A nurse rushed forward, her eyes widening when she recognized the unconscious man in his arms. Is that? He's burning up. Just help him. Seojun snapped, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The hospital staff sprang into action, wheeling Jungkook away through the sterile white halls. Seojun stood frozen, hands curled into fists, his entire body tense. He wanted to follow. He needed to. But then, the weight of reality crashed down on him. He was a street kid. Filthy, unwanted. He didn't belong here. A security guard approached, eyes scanning Seojun's torn hoodie and scuffed sneakers with thinly veiled suspicion. Hey kid, what's your connection to him? Seojun hesitated. The truth was simple, he had Jungkook's wallet. He could tell them that. But something in him clenched at the thought of being accused of stealing, of being tossed out before he could be sure Jungkook was okay. I found him like that, he lied, his fingers tightening around the wallet in his pocket. The guard frowned but didn't press. Seojun took a slow step back, then another, until the fluorescent lights of the hospital blurred into the night behind him. The streets swallowed him whole. Seoul at night was a different beast. Shadows stretched longer, people walked faster, avoiding eye contact. Seojun pulled his hoodie tighter, trying to block out the bitter cold gnawing at his bones. His stomach churned, both from hunger and the weight of what he had just done. He could have kept the wallet, could have used the money to disappear, to buy food, maybe even a cheap motel room for the night. Instead, he had thrown himself into a situation where he had nothing to gain. Why? Seojun kicked at a loose stone, frustration bubbling in his chest. Maybe because, deep down, he knew what it felt like to collapse in the middle of a busy street and have no one care. He gritted his teeth. It didn't matter. Jungkook was safe now. That was enough. At least that's what he told himself. Days passed. The city moved on, and so did Seojun. Or at least he tried to. But then the headlines came. Jungkook rushed to hospital. Collapses due to exhaustion. Anonymous Good Samaritan saves BTS star. Identity unknown. Seojun's grip on the newspaper tightened. His hands were numb from the cold, but his chest burned with something else entirely. Jungkook was looking for him. In every interview, every post, the idol kept asking the same thing. To the boy who helped me that night. If you're out there, please, let me thank you. Seojun swallowed hard. Jungkook had everything. The world at his feet, millions who adored him. So why did he sound so desperate? And why did Seojun feel like running? You're looking for me. Seojun's voice barely rose above a whisper, but the weight of the words crashed over him like a tidal wave. He stood in the shadow of a flickering street lamp, clutching a battered payphone. His heart pounded so hard it felt like his ribs might crack. On the other end of the line there was silence. Then, who is this? The voice was rough, urgent. Seojun's fingers dug into the cold metal of the phone. His throat was dry, and for a second, he wanted to slam the receiver down and disappear forever. But it was too late. He had already called the number printed on the news. Jungkook's manager had picked up. Seojun swallowed. His entire body screamed at him to lie, to pretend this was a mistake. But his hands, shaking and cold, slipped into his pocket, brushing against the leather of Jungkook's wallet. He closed his eyes. No more running. I'm the one who found Jungkook that night. The next hours blurred. The call led to a meeting, and the meeting led to now. Seojun, sitting stiffly in the corner of a sleek black van, his hoodie damp from the rain outside. Across from him, Jungkook sat silent. He looked different up close. Less like the untouchable idol Seojun had seen on street posters, and more like a man who had been running on empty for too long. Dark circles framed his tired eyes. His fingers fidgeted against his jeans, like he didn't know what to say. Then he did. You saved me. Seojun flinched. He wasn't used to people looking at him like this, like he mattered. Jungkook leaned forward. Why didn't you come sooner? His voice wasn't accusing, just desperate. Seojun hesitated, then exhaled a quiet laugh. You think someone like me belongs in your world? Jungkook blinked. Seojun looked down at his worn-out shoes. He had spent his life invisible, just another kid no one wanted. He didn't fit in glossy magazines or million-dollar concerts. But then Jungkook did something unexpected. He took out his wallet, the one Seojun had returned, and opened it. He pulled out a folded, crumpled bill. This was inside when I got it back, Jungkook said softly, unfolding the paper. Seojun's breath hitched. It was his note, the one he had written before slipping the wallet into Jungkook's hand at the hospital. A simple request. Buy a meal for someone like me. Silence stretched. Then Jungkook swallowed hard, his eyes glassy. You could have taken the money and walked away. Seojun scoffed. I wanted to. But you didn't. Seojun's throat tightened. He had no answer to that. Jungkook leaned back, studying him with something unreadable in his gaze. Then quietly, stay. Seojun froze. What? Stay with me? Jungkook repeated. Let me help you. The words cracked something inside Seojun. Something he had buried a long time ago. Hope. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he should run. The rain drummed softly against the tinted windows, a rhythmic whisper against the silence stretching inside the van. Seojun kept his head down, fingers clenched in his lap, his damp hoodie sticking uncomfortably to his skin. The warmth of the car's interior felt foreign. Too clean, too soft, too far from the cold streets he called home. Across from him, Jungkook studied him in quiet contemplation, his knuckles white against the worn paper clutched in his hands. The same note Seojun had left in the wallet. The ink was smudged from where Jungkook had folded and unfolded it, as if he had read those few words over and over again. Buy a meal for someone like me. A simple request. Yet it had left a crack in the world of a man who had everything. Jungkook exhaled slowly, the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts pressing against his ribs. His gaze flickered to the boy before him, thin, wary, wearing a mask of indifference that failed to hide the deep, lingering exhaustion in his eyes. Why didn't you come sooner? The question left Jungkook's lips before he could stop it. Seojun stiffened but didn't look up. A beat passed, then another. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost lost beneath the hum of the car's engine. You think someone like me belongs in your world? Jungkook opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no easy answer to that, because the truth was, Seojun was right. Their worlds were not meant to collide. One of them lived under blinding stage lights, drowning in applause. The other had spent years learning how to disappear into the cracks of the city. And yet, here they were. Jungkook's grip on the note tightened. You could have taken the money and walked away. A hollow chuckle slipped from Seojun's lips. I wanted to, but you didn't. Seojun's fingers twitched. His throat burned. He had no answer to that. For a long moment, there was nothing but the distant murmur of rain and the occasional splash of tires against wet pavement. Then Jungkook leaned forward, his voice low, steady, certain. Stay. Seojun's head snapped up. What? Stay with me? Jungkook repeated, his dark eyes locking onto Seojun's. Let me help you. Seojun stared at him, heart pounding in his chest, an unfamiliar warmth curling somewhere deep inside him. Hope was a dangerous thing, and yet, for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he should run. The silence stretched between them, thick and unsteady, like the moment before a storm. Seojun's breath came shallow, his body tense, every instinct in him screaming to get out. Out of this van, out of this conversation, out of the reach of something he had long since learned to live without. Jungkook was still watching him, waiting. His words lingered in the space between them. Stay. Let me help you. Seojun forced a laugh, but it came out hollow. Help me? His fingers curled into the damp fabric of his hoodie. You don't even know me. Jungkook didn't flinch. I know enough. Oh yeah. Seojun scoffed. His voice was sharper than he intended, something raw bleeding into his tone. And what is it you think you know? Jungkook's gaze never wavered. I know you had nothing, and yet, when the universe gave you the chance to take, you chose to give instead. Seojun's breath hitched. He clenched his jaw, trying to ignore the way his chest ached at those words. That doesn't mean I belong here. Then where do you belong? Jungkook's voice was calm, but there was something desperate beneath it, something pleading. On the streets? Alone? Seojun swallowed hard. That was the thing, wasn't it? He didn't belong anywhere. Jungkook sighed, running a hand through his hair before leaning back against the seat. The exhaustion was evident in the way his shoulders sagged, in the way his fingers lingered over the folded paper in his hand. You don't have to decide now, he murmured. Just stay for tonight. Eat, rest. If you want to leave after that, I won't stop you. Seojun hesitated. The offer was too good, too easy, and things like that never lasted. But his stomach twisted at the thought of stepping back into the cold, of curling up on some rain-dampened alleyway while the rest of the world moved on without him. One night, just one. His fingers loosened their grip on his hoodie. Fine. His voice was quiet, barely audible over the rain. One night. Jungkook didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply nodded, as if he had known all along that Seojun would say yes. The van rumbled forward, cutting through the night. Seojun leaned his head back against the seat, eyes slipping closed. For the first time in a long time, the weight on his shoulders felt just a little lighter. He didn't dare believe it would last. The drive was quiet. The only sounds the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows. Seojun kept his gaze locked on the blurred city lights outside, his body stiff, his fingers still curled into the sleeves of his hoodie. He had agreed to stay for one night. That was all. And yet, Deep in his chest, a strange unease settled. Something like fear, something like longing. The van slowed, pulling into an underground parking garage. The moment the doors unlocked with a soft click, Seojun hesitated, his muscles coiling tight, the urge to run nearly overwhelming. Jungkook stepped out first. He didn't turn, didn't force Seojun to follow. He just waited. Seojun exhaled sharply and climbed out. The air inside the building was warm, too warm, and the moment the elevator doors slid shut behind them, he felt suffocated. The walls were too clean, the space too quiet. His hands itched to shove themselves into his pockets, to curl inward, to disappear. Jungkook's home was nothing like the world Seojun knew. The elevator chimed. Doors slid open to reveal a penthouse that looked like it belonged in a dream. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Sleek furniture. Soft lighting that made everything feel impossibly distant from the streets below. Seojun didn't move. "Come in," Jungkook said simply, stepping inside. Seojun forced himself forward, his steps cautious, like the floor might give way beneath him. The warmth of the space wrapped around him, unfamiliar and dangerous. He didn't belong here. Jungkook tossed his jacket onto the couch and gestured toward the kitchen. "You hungry?" Seojun's stomach twisted. He hadn't eaten all day, but hunger was something he had learned to ignore, to push down until it became nothing more than a dull ache. He didn't want to owe Jungkook anything. "I'm fine," he muttered. Jungkook's brow furrowed. "That's not an answer." Seojun's jaw tightened. He hated this, hated feeling seen, hated the way Jungkook looked at him, like he was something fragile instead of something sharp-edged and broken. Before he could protest, Jungkook was already moving, pulling open the fridge, grabbing whatever he could find. Within minutes, a bowl of hot ramen was placed in front of Seojun, steam curling in the air. "Eat." Seojun hesitated. The smell hit him first, rich, warm, the kind of meal he had only ever dreamed about. His hands twitched. Jungkook didn't say anything else. He simply sat across from Seojun, silent, waiting. The first bite burned his tongue, but he didn't care. The second was slower, the third even slower, until the tension in his shoulders began to fade. For the first time in years, he wasn't eating scraps. He wasn't stealing. He wasn't fighting for his next meal. He was just eating. Halfway through the bowl, his vision blurred. He hadn't realized how tired he was. Jungkook didn't speak, didn't push. He simply sat there, watching as the boy across from him slowly lowered his chopsticks, his body swaying with exhaustion. Seojun tried to fight it. He tried to stay alert, to remind himself that this was temporary, that warmth and safety were illusions. But the weight of the day pressed down on him, heavier than anything he had ever carried. His fingers slipped. The chopsticks clattered against the table. Jungkook barely had time to move before Seojun's body slumped forward, his head hitting the edge of his arms, his breath coming slow and steady. Fast asleep. Jungkook exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. He had seen exhaustion before. He had felt it in his own bones. But the way Seojun had collapsed told him everything he needed to know. This boy had spent too long fighting to survive. And Jungkook wasn't sure if one night would be enough to fix that. The night stretched on, quiet and still. The soft glow of the city lights painted the penthouse in hues of blue and gold, shadows shifting against the walls. Jungkook sat on the edge of the couch, elbows resting on his knees, watching the slow rise and fall of Seojun's chest. The boy was still curled in on himself, even in sleep, as if his body had memorized the habit of making itself smaller, of taking up as little space as possible. Jungkook had seen exhaustion before. He had felt it in his own bones after endless nights of rehearsals, performances, flights that left him drained beyond words. But this was different. This was survival. His fingers itched to do something, to help, to fix, to understand. But he knew better than anyone that some wounds ran too deep for simple kindness to heal. Jungkook exhaled, pushing himself up. His body ached with the remnants of the past few days, but the weight in his chest was heavier. He grabbed a glass of water and set it on the coffee table next to Seojun, then stood there for a long moment, staring down at the boy who had turned his world upside down with nothing more than a lost wallet and a single handwritten note. "Buy a meal for someone like me." Jungkook had held onto those words ever since the hospital, reading them over and over until they were carved into his mind. He had tried to imagine the person behind them, tried to understand the kind of life that would lead someone to write something so simple yet so devastating. And now that person was here. A quiet sigh left Jungkook's lips as he turned away, running a hand through his hair. He needed rest, his body was demanding it, but his mind refused to settle. Still, sleep found him eventually, somewhere between exhaustion and quiet determination. The first thing Seo-jun noticed was warmth. For a split second, he thought he had woken up in a dream. The couch beneath him was soft. The scent of fresh laundry clung to the blanket draped over his body. The air smelled like something light and clean, nothing like the damp concrete and cigarette smoke he was used to. His fingers twitched, gripping the edge of the blanket before his eyes even opened. Then it hit him. The night before. The van. Jungkook. His body went rigid. His eyes snapped open, and for a moment his brain struggled to catch up with what he was seeing. Sunlight filtered through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, spilling golden light across the penthouse. The city stretched beyond the glass, sprawling and endless. Too big. Too much. This wasn't his world. Seo-jun shoved the blanket off of him, his heart pounding. His hoodie was still damp from the night before, his limbs stiff from exhaustion, but his mind was already racing. He had to leave. Now. Before. Asterisk, you're awake. Asterisk. Seo-jun flinched. Jungkook stood a few feet away, dressed in a simple black hoodie and sweatpants, hair still tousled from sleep. His eyes were calm, unreadable, but there was something beneath the surface, something searching. Seo-jun's hands curled into fists. Asterisk, I need to go. Asterisk. Jungkook didn't move. Didn't react. He just watched him for a long moment before asking asterisk, why? Asterisk. Seo-jun's throat tightened. Asterisk, because I don't belong here. Asterisk. Jungkook tilted his head slightly. Asterisk says who? Asterisk. A scoff slipped past Seo-jun's lips, sharp and bitter. Asterisk reality. Asterisk. Jungkook let out a breath, something between a sigh and a quiet chuckle. Asterisk, you act like I dragged you here against your will. Asterisk. Seo-jun looked away. His chest felt tight, the air in the room suddenly too heavy. He had learned long ago that things like this didn't last. A warm place to sleep. A full meal. The illusion of kindness. It always came with a price. I don't need your help, he muttered, moving toward the door. But before he could take another step, Jungkook spoke. Asterisk, then why did you come? Asterisk. Seo-jun froze. His breath caught in his throat. His mind scrambled for an answer, for a lie, for anything that would let him walk out of this place without looking back. But nothing came. Jungkook didn't press him. He just stood there, waiting, letting the question linger in the air between them. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Finally, Seo-jun exhaled sharply and turned back, his voice quiet, almost defeated. Asterisk, because I was tired. Asterisk. Jungkook's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. Asterisk, then stay until you're not. Asterisk. Seo-jun stared at him, heart pounding, every instinct in his body screaming at him to run. But his legs wouldn't move. His fingers twitched at his sides. Jungkook wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't demanding, he wasn't pushing. He was offering. And for the first time in a long, long time, Seo-jun didn't know how to say no. Seo-jun's breath came slow and uneven. His mind screamed at him to leave, to disappear before this fragile moment turned into something he'd regret. But his body refused to move. Jungkook was still watching him, calm and steady, as if he had all the time in the world to wait for Seo-jun to decide. Stay until you're not. Those words echoed in his head, carving cracks into the armor he had spent years building. His fingers twitched. His stomach ached, not from hunger, but from something else. Something unfamiliar. Hope. He hated it. But more than that, he feared it. Seo-jun swallowed hard and forced himself to look away. His voice was barely more than a whisper. One more night. Jungkook didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just nodded. All right. No questions. No demands. Just acceptance. Seo-jun didn't know what to do with that. The day stretched on in slow, unfamiliar silence. Jungkook moved through his penthouse with an ease that made Seo-jun feel even more out of place. He made coffee, answered a few calls in a low voice, disappeared into a studio room for a few hours. Seo-jun, on the other hand, sat stiffly on the couch, hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie, eyes darting around the apartment like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. The place was huge. Too clean. Too empty. It smelled like fresh linen and something faintly expensive, like the kind of cologne Seo-jun had only ever smelled when he passed by luxury department stores. He didn't belong here. His mind whispered it over and over. And yet, Jungkook acted like his presence was normal. Like he wasn't a street kid sitting in the middle of a life he had no business touching. A plate of food appeared in front of him at some point, warm rice, eggs, and something that smelled rich and savory. Seojun didn't ask where it came from and Jungkook didn't tell him. He just ate. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel like he had to fight for every bite. The sky was bleeding into dusk when Jungkook finally spoke again. "You've been quiet all day." Seojun flinched slightly. He had been staring at the skyline through the massive windows, lost in thought. He turned his head just enough to glance at Jungkook, who was sitting on the other end of the couch nursing a cup of tea. "I don't talk much," Jungkook hummed. "I noticed." Silence. Then, before Seojun could stop himself, the words slipped out. "Do you ever get tired of it?" Jungkook's brow furrowed slightly. "Of what?" Seojun gestured vaguely around the room. "All this. The fame, the money, the expectations." Jungkook didn't answer right away. Instead, he set his tea down on the table, fingers tapping against the ceramic. "Sometimes," he admitted, "it's not as easy as people think." Seojun scoffed before he could stop himself. "Easy? You have everything." Jungkook's lips pressed into a thin line. "Do I?" Seojun opened his mouth, then hesitated. There was something about the way Jungkook said it, something heavy, something real. A strange silence settled between them, thick with words unspoken. Then Jungkook leaned back against the couch, his expression unreadable. "Maybe we're not as different as you think." Seojun wanted to argue. Wanted to tell him that they were nothing alike. But the words never came. And for the first time since he had stepped into this penthouse, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. Night fell again. Seojun lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts a tangled mess. He had to leave. He should leave. This wasn't his world. But the warmth of the blanket was comforting. The memory of a full meal still lingered on his tongue. And then there was Jungkook. A man who had everything yet looked at Seojun like he understood him. Like he saw him. Seojun swallowed hard, his fingers tightening into the fabric of his hoodie. Just one more night. That's what he had told himself yesterday. And yet, as sleep finally pulled him under, a part of him whispered a truth he wasn't ready to face. He wasn't sure he wanted to go at all. Morning arrived slowly, creeping in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting golden streaks across the penthouse floor. The air smelled faintly of coffee and something warm, something unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. Seojun stirred, his body instinctively curling in on itself before his brain caught up to where he was. Not the streets. Not a cold alley. Warmth. A blanket. A real couch beneath him. The realization made his chest tighten. "You're awake." Seojun flinched. His head snapped up, eyes locking onto Jungkook, who stood by the kitchen counter, one hand wrapped around a coffee mug, the other tapping idly against the marble surface. "I made breakfast," Jungkook said casually, as if they had done this 100 times before. Seojun didn't move. His fingers twitched against the blanket, his entire body still coiled tight, waiting for something to go wrong. "I told you I'm not hungry." Jungkook exhaled through his nose, but instead of arguing, he just turned and set a plate on the counter. "Eat if you want." "I don't care." Seojun hesitated. It was a trap, it had to be. Kindness always came with a price. And yet, the smell of eggs and rice hit his senses, and his stomach betrayed him with a quiet, humiliating growl. His face burned. Jungkook didn't react. He just sipped his coffee. Seojun clenched his jaw and forced himself to sit up, fingers running through his tangled hair. His hoodie was still slightly damp from yesterday's rain, and the weight of the past few days sat heavy in his bones. He had to leave. He should leave. And yet, against every survival instinct he had ever known, he found himself pushing off the couch and walking toward the counter. Jungkook didn't say anything as Seojun picked up the plate, didn't comment when he hesitated for half a second before shoving a bite of warm rice into his mouth. He just sat there, watching with an expression Seojun couldn't read. As if he was waiting. It wasn't until later, long after the food had disappeared, after the silence had settled between them, that Jungkook finally asked the question Seojun had been dreading. "What happens after this?" Seojun tensed, fingers tightening against the sleeves of his hoodie. "I leave." Jungkook didn't flinch. And then, Seojun's throat tightened. He didn't answer. Because the truth was he didn't know. He had spent years scraping by, moving from one place to another, surviving however he could. He had never needed a plan because the world had never given him the luxury of making one. But now, standing here, in this impossibly clean kitchen, surrounded by warmth he had never known before, for the first time, the idea of leaving felt wrong. like he was about to step away from something he wasn't ready to lose. Jungkook studied him, his gaze sharp but not unkind. You don't have to keep running. Seo-jun scoffed. And do what? Stay here forever. Why not? His head snapped up. Jungkook's expression was unreadable. No one's asking you to go. Seo-jun's chest ached. His fists clenched. I don't belong here. Who said that? Seo-jun opened his mouth, then shut it. He had no answer. Jungkook leaned forward slightly, voice softer now. You're not alone, Seo-jun. You don't have to be. The words hit harder than they should have. Seo-jun's fingers curled tighter into his sleeves, his heartbeat loud in his ears. His entire life had been a series of people leaving, of being abandoned before he had the chance to get attached. But now for the first time someone was telling him to stay. And he didn't know how to handle it. The hours passed slowly. Seo-jun stayed on the couch, staring at the ceiling, thoughts tangled in a mess he couldn't untangle. Jungkook had disappeared into his studio, leaving Seo-jun alone with the silence. He should leave? He needed to leave. But his body refused to move. Because deep down, beneath all the walls and all the survival instincts, a small, fragile part of him didn't want to. For the first time in his life, he had been given the option to stay. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could walk away. The hours passed slowly. Seo-jun stayed on the couch, staring at the ceiling, thoughts tangled in a mess he couldn't untangle. Jungkook had disappeared into his studio, leaving Seo-jun alone with the silence. He should leave? He needed to leave. But his body refused to move. Because deep down, beneath all the walls and all the survival instincts, a small, fragile part of him didn't want to. For the first time in his life, he had been given the option to stay. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could walk away. You said. End. ChatGPT said. Episode 10, The Choice That Changes Everything. The city stretched endlessly beyond the windows, its lights flickering like distant stars. Rain drummed lightly against the glass, a soft rhythm that filled the quiet between them. Seo-jun stood near the door, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His hoodie was still slightly too big, still worn at the edges, still carrying the weight of the streets he had once called home. Jungkook stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable. So that's it? His voice was quiet. Steady. But Seo-jun could hear the weight beneath it. Seo-jun swallowed hard. I never planned on staying this long. Jungkook let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. You don't have to go. The words cut deep. Because a part of Seo-jun wanted to believe them. A part of him wanted to stay, to let himself believe that warmth and safety weren't temporary things, that he could have something more than just survival. But hope was dangerous. Hope led to disappointment. Hope made it hurt more when everything fell apart. You were never supposed to help me, Seo-jun muttered, voice barely above a whisper. Jungkook's jaw tightened. You saved my life, Seo-jun. Why is it so hard to let someone do the same for you? Seo-jun had no answer. His fingers tightened around the strap of his backpack. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, a war raging inside him. Jungkook took a slow step closer. His voice softened. Tell me one thing. Seo-jun hesitated. If you walk out that door, will you be okay? The question shattered something inside him. Because the answer was no. He wouldn't be okay. He would go back to the streets, back to hunger, back to a life where no one looked twice at him. He would disappear all over again. And maybe that was what he was used to. But it wasn't what he wanted. His breath hitched. His feet refused to move. Jungkook didn't push him. He just stood there, waiting, offering something that no one ever had before. A choice. A future. A home. The backpack slipped from Seo-jun's shoulder. Jungkook exhaled, relief washing over his face. And for the first time in years, Seo-jun took a step towards something, towards someone, rather than away. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to disappear. Maybe this time, staying was the right choice. And as Jungkook gave him a quiet, understanding nod, Seo-jun finally let himself believe it.